few hours to my wedding, I found out my fiancé slept with my best friend of 19 years, exactly 2 hours before I was supposed to marry him. I didn't cry at the altar. I didn't scream. I didn't fall apart the way every movie tells you a bride is supposed to fall apart on the worst morning of her life. Instead, I stood in front of 200 guests, in a dress I had paid for with my own 2 hands, and I did something that not one single person in that church expected, including me. This is the story of the day I canceled my own wedding, and the year that followed, which taught me more about who I really was than that wedding ever could have. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comment section where you're watching from. We will love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit the like and follow button so you won't miss our upcoming videos. My name is Diane Marsh, and at 49 years old, I was not the kind of woman anyone expected to end up standing in a church, canceling her own wedding into a cordless microphone. I want to back up, because to understand what I did that morning, you have to understand who I was before it. I lost my first husband, Robert, to a heart attack when our daughter Melissa was 6 years old. He was 34. One ordinary Tuesday, he went to work at the lumber yard he'd run since he was 22, and he never came home. I was left, at 28, with a 6-year-old, a mortgage, and $11,000 in savings that was supposed to last us until I figured something out. I did figure it out. Slowly, and the hard way, the only way I've ever figured anything out. I trained as a physical therapist while Melissa was in elementary school, working night shifts at a nursing home to pay for the coursework. By the time she graduated high school, I'd opened my first clinic in a rented storefront that used to be a dry cleaner. You could still smell the chemicals in the walls the first 2 years. By the time she graduated college, I had 2 locations. By the year of my almost wedding, I had 3, employing 18 people, and a reputation in our county as the woman who could fix a torn rotator cuff better than anyone within 60 miles. I tell you all of this not to brag, but because it matters for what comes later. I was not a woman without options. I was not a woman who needed rescuing. When I met Gerald Whitmore, I was not looking for someone to complete me. I had already, quietly and privately, completed myself. My parents, Harold and Jean, were still living then, both in their late 70s, in the same small house I'd grown up in 2 towns over. My father had never said much about Robert's death. He wasn't a man of many words, but he'd shown up every single Sunday for 6 years after the funeral, without fail, just to fix something around my house that didn't really need fixing, so he'd have a reason to check on me, without ever having to ask how I was doing out loud. My mother was the opposite. She called every evening at 6, rain or shine, just to hear my voice. When I told them about Gerald, my father shook his hand a beat too long and said, "You take care of my daughter," in a tone that wasn't quite a joke. My mother cried at the engagement dinner and told me, quietly, in the kitchen while we did dishes, that she'd been praying for this for years, not for a wedding, she said, but for someone to simply be kind to me the way I'd spent 2 decades being kind to everyone else. Gerald ran a small commercial insurance agency on the 2nd floor above my main clinic. We met the ordinary way: an elevator, a dropped folder, an apology, a coffee that turned into a habit. He was 52, recently divorced, with 2 adult sons from his first marriage, who lived out of state, and called him twice a year. What drew me to Gerald wasn't fireworks, it was steadiness. He remembered that I took my coffee with real cream, never that fake powder stuff. He remembered the date of Robert's death every single year, and instead of making it a production, he'd simply show up that evening with takeout from the Thai place Robert used to love, and sit with me quietly while I looked through old photos. Small things. The kind of things that, at 47 years old, mean far more to a woman than grand gestures ever could. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. I said yes in my kitchen, standing barefoot on the same tile I'd mopped 1,000 times as a single mother, and I remember thinking quite clearly, I get a second chance at this. Not everyone does. I was right about that, actually, just not in the way I expected. My maid of honor was Carol Jensen. Carol and I had been friends for 19 years, since our daughters were in the same kindergarten class at Fairview Elementary. Carol had been through 2 divorces of her own by the time she stood beside me at my engagement party, and she used to joke often, and loudly, after a glass of wine that I had gotten the last good one left in this entire county. I laughed every time she said it. I had no reason not to. Carol had helped me pick out my dress 8 months before the wedding, sitting in the corner of the bridal shop with a box of tissues, crying real tears when I stepped out in the one I finally chose, a simple ivory gown. No beading, nothing flashy, exactly the kind of dress a woman in her late 40s wears when she isn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She helped me plan the seating chart. She talked me through my nerves the week before, sitting on my back porch 2 glasses of wine deep, telling me Gerald was one of the good ones, and that I deserved every single bit of this. I believed every word. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters. Looking back now, there were small things, little moments I noticed and dismissed, the way we all do when we don't want to see something. Carol checking her phone a little too quickly whenever Gerald walked into a room. A joke, once, at the engagement party, about how some people just have all the luck. That landed a half-second too flat. I noticed these things the way you notice a single cloud on an otherwise clear day. You clock it, and then you go back to your picnic, because who wants to ruin a beautiful afternoon over one cloud? I didn't know yet that the cloud was the whole storm. The night before the wedding, I hosted a small family dinner at my house, close family only, along with Gerald and Carol. Nothing fancy, a pot roast, my mother's old recipe, the same one I'd made every year on Robert's birthday out of habit, though I never told anyone that detail. Everyone left around 9 that evening. Gerald was the last to say goodnight at the door, and he said something to me I still remember, word for word, all these months later. "Tomorrow," he said, "I get to spend the rest of my life proving you made the right decision." I've turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I can count since. At the time, it sounded romantic. Looking back, it sounds almost like a confession dressed up as a promise, a man talking himself into believing his own future, even as he already knew what he'd done, or was about to do. Carol left about 20 minutes after Gerald. She hugged me longer than usual at the door, long enough that I actually remarked on it, laughing, asking if she was more nervous about this wedding than I was. She laughed too, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I noticed she checked her phone twice in the 30 seconds it took to walk her to her car. I told myself it was nothing. Weddings make everyone a little strange, a little emotional, a little distracted. I had no reason, that night, to believe otherwise. At 11 o'clock, lying in bed unable to sleep, I sent Carol a photo of my dress hanging on the closet door, the same one she'd cried over 8 months earlier. She didn't respond until almost 7 the next morning, which wasn't like her at all. Carol was the kind of friend who answered a 3 a.m. text within minutes. When her reply finally came, it was 3 words. "Beautiful. See you soon." I had no idea, lying in that bed going over the seating chart one more time, out of pure nervous habit, that the 2 people I trusted most in the entire world were, at that very hour, together in a hotel room, 11 minutes from my house. I woke at 6:30 to get my hair done. Carol was supposed to meet me at the salon at 7, the way we'd planned for months, to help me into my dress afterward, the same ritual we'd rehearsed a dozen times in her living room, practicing the buttons on the back so we wouldn't fumble on the actual day. She never showed. By 8:15, I had called her 4 times, straight to voicemail every time. I told myself, sitting in that salon chair with pins already halfway through my hair, that she must have overslept, that her phone had died, that this would become a funny story we'd laugh about at our 10th anniversary party. I finished getting ready without her, my hands doing up my own back buttons in the mirror, alone. At 9 o'clock, running slightly ahead of schedule, I decided to swing by her hotel on my way to the church. She was staying at the same hotel as some of Gerald's extended family, only 15 minutes from the venue, and I had a small gift bag for her that I'd forgotten to give her the night before, a bracelet actually, engraved with our daughter's initials, a thank you gift for 19 years of friendship. I knocked on her door. It took almost a full minute before it opened. Gerald answered it. He was standing there in yesterday's clothes, his shirt only half buttoned, and for one full second, my mind simply refused to process what I was looking at, the way your mind sometimes protects you, right up until the very last possible moment. Behind him, across the room, Carol was sitting on the edge of the unmade bed, still in her robe, staring at the carpet, not looking at me at all. Nobody said a single word for what felt like an entire minute, though it was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. I remember, strangely, becoming very aware of the gift bag still hanging from my wrist, and thinking how absurd it looked, dangling there in the space between the 3 of us. Diane, Gerald finally said, his voice cracking on the second syllable of my own name. This isn't I can explain. I didn't wait to hear the rest of that sentence. I have wondered, many times since, what the end of it would even have been. I turned around, walked back to my car in my full hair and makeup, still 4 hours from my wedding, and I drove myself to the church. I want to be honest with you about something most people don't admit in stories like this one. I don't remember most of that 15-minute drive. I remember gripping the steering wheel hard enough that my knuckles went completely white. I remember the radio was on, playing some song I couldn't tell you the name of if my life depended on it. I remember, somewhere around a red light 2 blocks from the church, feeling something shift inside my chest, not sadness yet, something closer to clarity, something closer to the exact same feeling I'd had 21 years earlier, standing in a funeral home at 28 years old, realizing that no one was coming to save me, and that I would simply have to save myself instead. I had done it once before. I understood, sitting at that red light in my wedding dress, that I was fully capable of doing it again. By the time I pulled into the church parking lot, 200 guests were already seated inside. My daughter Melissa, now 27 years old, was waiting for me at the side entrance in her bridesmaid dress, and the very second she saw my face, she knew. "Mom," she said, her voice already shaking. "What happened?" "Get me a microphone," I told her, surprising myself with how steady my own voice sounded. "And find out if Gerald has made it here yet." Gerald arrived 11 minutes later, alone. Carol was nowhere in sight. He found me standing at the very front of the church, still in my wedding dress, holding a cordless microphone. One of the ushers had quietly brought me from the sound booth, without asking a single question, I think, looking back, that he understood exactly what kind of morning this had become, before I ever said a word. I did not scream. I did not cry. I have replayed this moment so many times since that I can tell you, almost word for word, exactly what I said, calm enough that my voice carried cleanly to the very last row without so much as a tremor. "Good morning, everyone," I began. "Thank you all so much for being here today, and for the beautiful gifts, and for taking time out of your lives to celebrate what I believed, until about 90 minutes ago, was going to be the happiest day of my life." A ripple of confused laughter moved through the room, the kind of laughter people make when they're not yet sure whether something is a joke. "I'm not going to marry a man," I continued, "who I found this morning, in a hotel room, with my best friend of 19 years. So instead, we are all going to go home. The caterers have already been paid in full, so please, take a plate on your way out. Nothing here should go to waste today, even if the morning already has." There was a silence in that church I do not believe I will ever forget for the rest of my life. It lasted, I would guess, 4 or 5 full seconds an eternity, in a room of 200 people. In that silence I found my father's face in the second row. Harold Marsh, 78 years old, in the one good suit he owned, sat with his jaw tight, and his eyes fixed on me not with shock, I realized, but with something closer to pride, like a man watching his daughter do the hardest, most necessary thing he'd ever seen her do. Beside him, my mother already had a hand pressed over her mouth, tears running freely, nodding at me, just slightly, as if to say, "Go on, finish it." Then, from somewhere in the third row, one single person began to clap. I never found out who it was. By the time I set that microphone down and began walking back down the aisle, alone, in my own wedding dress, head held level, at least half of that room was clapping along with her. Gerald tried to follow me toward the doors. I turned around exactly once, standing at the threshold of that church, sunlight pouring in behind me, and I said the only other thing I ever said to him again. "You had 2 years to prove that I made the right decision." I told him, "You had 9 hours left, and you spent every single one of them proving I'd made the wrong one instead. Don't call me. Don't write me. Don't send flowers. There is nothing left here for you to apologize your way back into." Here is something nobody tells you about a morning like that one. The wedding ending is not, in fact, the hardest part. The hardest part is the ordinary Tuesday, 3 weeks later, when you finally take the dress to the dry cleaner, not because you'll ever wear it again, but because you simply cannot stand to look at it hanging in your closet for one more single day. The hardest part is unsubscribing, one by one, from the vendor email threads you'd been part of for 8 months. The florist, the DJ, the photographer who still, awkwardly, sent one final invoice for the engagement photos, 3 weeks after everything fell apart, with a small handwritten note at the bottom. "I'm so sorry. Those photos were beautiful. I hope you're doing okay." I cried more in those 3 quiet weeks than I did on the actual day itself. I think adrenaline carries you further than anyone expects, right up until it doesn't anymore. My mother came over almost every single one of those evenings, letting herself in with her old key without knocking, and sat with me on the couch while I said very little, the same way my father had once shown up every Sunday after Robert died, without ever making me explain myself. Neither of my parents ever once said, "I told you so," though I knew, later, that my father had never fully trusted Gerald's habit of checking his phone at family dinners. He simply said, one evening, setting a cup of tea down in front of me, "You did the hard part already. The rest of this is just time." My father wasn't a man who handed out wisdom often, but when he did, it tended to stay with you for good. But here is what I also learned, slowly, in the months that followed that quiet, terrible Tuesday. That prenuptial agreement, I had insisted on, the one Gerald had signed without much argument, the one I'd built not out of distrust but out of hard-won experience, had a clause in it that Gerald had apparently barely glanced at before signing. It protected the venue deposit and every vendor payment I had personally made, in the event the marriage did not proceed for any reason. I did not lose a single dollar that Gerald had not already agreed, in writing, 2 years earlier, that I would not lose. Carol tried calling me 4 months later. I let it ring straight through to voicemail, the same way she had once let mine ring through on a morning that mattered far more. My daughter told me, secondhand, through a mutual friend, that Carol and Gerald's relationship, if you could even call it that, had fallen apart entirely within about 10 weeks of that morning at the church. It turns out, unsurprisingly, that a man who will cheat with a bride's best friend on the very morning of her wedding is not, in fact, a man either woman should have trusted with anything at all. My clinics kept growing that year, almost in spite of everything. I opened a 4th location that spring, in a strip mall 2 towns over, that I'd had my eye on for nearly a year. I took my daughter to Portugal that summer, a trip I had originally planned, quietly, as a surprise honeymoon add-on for Gerald and me. I went instead with Melissa, and I can tell you, without exaggeration, that it remains one of the finest 2 weeks of my entire adult life. We drank wine on a terrace in Porto, and laughed until we cried about absolutely nothing at all, and for the first time in almost a year, I felt entirely, completely like myself again. I ran into Gerald almost exactly 1 year later, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, in the plumbing aisle of a hardware store 2 towns from where either of us lived, one of those strange, small coincidences life occasionally hands you, seemingly just to see what you'll do with it. He looked older than I remembered, tired, a little grayer at the temples. He was alone, holding a single light bulb, the kind of small, sad detail you couldn't invent if you tried. He saw me before I saw him. He started to say something, I still don't know what, and I never will, because I didn't give him the chance to finish. "Gerald," I said, the way you might greet an old coworker you vaguely remember from a job you left years ago. Nothing more. Then I turned back to the shelf of drawer pulls I'd actually come in for, and finished my shopping. I felt nothing standing in that aisle. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even the small, mean flicker of triumph I might have expected to feel, given everything. Just nothing at all. And I remember thinking, right there among the plumbing fixtures, that the nothing was the entire point. That is what healing had actually felt like. In the end, not fireworks, not some dramatic confrontation, not revenge served cold on a silver platter the way it happens in the movies. Just quiet, ordinary indifference, earned 1 long month at a time. I didn't lose a wedding that day. I lost 2 people who, as it turned out, were never really mine to keep in the first place, not in any way that mattered. What I gained instead was something no one, not Gerald, not Carol, not anyone else who might ever come along, can take away from me again. The absolute, bone-deep certainty of exactly who I am, and exactly what I will and will not accept, when it matters the very most. If you are watching this today, and you have ever had to walk away from something everyone around you expected you to simply go through with, I hope, from the bottom of my heart, that you know this. Closing one door yourself, even standing in front of 200 people, in your own wedding dress, holding a borrowed microphone with a steady hand that is sometimes the single bravest thing you will ever do in your entire life. And sometimes, the very best wedding gift you can ever give yourself is simply the truth, delivered on time, even when it arrives 2 hours later than you would have liked. Don't forget to hit the like and follow button for more.